Hello, this is Francescia Recchia, and I would like to welcome you on a new episode of the Police Project Dispatches series. In 1982, Myanmar passed a citizenship law that defined collective citizenship based on whether someone belongs to the so-called national races, who, according to the state, settled in Myanmar before the British colonization in 1824. The law did not include the Rohingya among the indigenous races, and as a consequence, they have been effectively excluded from full citizenship. And until that time, since that time, they've been victims of cycles of mass violence and prosecution in rounds in 1991, in 2012, in 2016, in 2017, and then again now. The February coup in Myanmar has been the cause of a new wave of forced migrations, a new exodus, in fact, that has added a terrible chapter to the plight of the Rohingya people in what seems to be an endless crisis. To help us understand the political context and the human cost of this ongoing crisis, we have here with us Meenakshi Ganguly. She is the South Asia Director at Human Rights Watch and has been with the organization since 2004. Over the years, her work has focused on police reform, sexual violence, discrimination based on religion and caste, freedom of expression, and armed conflict. Thanks, Meenakshi, for being with us today.
Thank you. Very nice to be with you. Sorry to be discussing something so awful, but here we are.
Before we start, we would like to share with you a poem that is titled Someone I'm Afraid Of by a Rohingya poet, Zakia Wise. The last lines of the poem read, I am a human in the universe, denied the most basic rights. I am someone I am afraid of. I want to start from here. In your essay titled Rohingya Refugees Caught Between India and a Hard Place, you write that Myanmar's Rohingya Muslims are among the most persecuted communities in the world. What is the condition and the history of Rohingya people in Myanmar, and what are the roots of such persecution?
Well, the Rohingya, just to explain, the Rohingya are ethnically a different group of people. They're ethnically separate. So just in terms of race, it's very important to know that the Rohingya are called Kala often, which means black. They are often called Bengali because they look South Asian. So there is an ethnic division, which is actually one of the root causes for the discrimination that the Rohingya face. In addition, of course, in recent times, there's an added layer to the reason why they're unpopular, and that's because they're also Muslim. But the initial thing was an ethnic issue. It is because the Burmese believed that these are people that came from what was originally British India, South Asia, and they are from what is now Bangladesh. What has happened, therefore, is that there has almost always been a tendency to sort of treat them as outsiders, which of course was, as you said, brought into law in 1982 when they became effectively stateless, because the citizenship law then excluded them. And that resulted in a sort of spate of struggles and various efforts. We know well of the ethnic cleansing that occurred in 2017, but we've actually witnessed it many times before that. including in 2016 when a group of people crossed over. There were 70,000 of them in Bangladesh. But even earlier, there have been spades of people that have crossed over, spades of people that have been returned. And the one thing that I should, before your next question, I just want to say that the Rohingya have not only not been welcomed in Myanmar, when they have tried to leave. In the numerous times we have seen these boats on Bay of Bengal, and Bay of Bengal is a very treacherous ocean. And the Rohingya have tried to escape to try and make their way to a better future, and almost all governments have pushed them back. In fact, at some point we used to say that they've been ping-ponged around by various governments. So it's a really desperate situation for the Rohingya right now. You're muted, Francesca.
I'm sorry, I'll never learn. So I was saying that you mentioned the citizenship law. So in 1982, this law, the Burmese citizenship law, was passed. And so what is peculiar about this law is that it's citizenship bestowed collectively rather than individually, as it happens in many legislations in most of the countries. And it is bestowed on a sense of belonging that is based on race. I mean, this is troubling at a multitude of levels. And maybe we can just note one of the multiple levels by referring to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is grounded on a principle of non-discrimination and stipulates that everyone has the right to a nationality. So can you help us understand how is it possible that a law such as this could even be passed?
That a law like this could have been passed is, of course, the state that was dealing with it. The question is, why did the international community accept such a law or allow it to exist in any books? Not only does it exist, this is why it's problematic. Because right now what happens is that there are all these countries that are saying they want to deport the Rohingya, they want to repatriate the Rohingya, they want to send the Rohingya back. But on what grounds? If Myanmar doesn't accept them as citizens, then on what grounds are states even suggesting that they want to deport these people or repatriate them or any of these things? So what we're happening, for instance, right now in Bangladesh is that Bangladesh has sent lists and lists of names of refugees that are in Bangladesh right now seeking repatriation. And the Myanmar authorities sent back lists that they have apparently verified. The Myanmar authorities even came to Bangladesh to the camps, and their basic offer is that the Rohingya should accept something called a national verification card, which denies them full citizenship. And this is what is the situation right now, where they have to look at this NVC, they call it, this verification card, but not full citizenship rights, including all the whole gamut of it, right to education, to health, the basic principles citizens enjoy.
So I want to continue on this, because I think it's a very difficult question to understand what it means to be turned into a stateless people. And so this idea of becoming stateless, as you just mentioned, as a consequence, the denial of the rights of full citizenship, and then a cascade of troubles that include the deprivation of fundamental rights, restriction on marriage. There's strict diktats on who may or may not marry whom. Then there is forced labor. There is expropriation of land. So I mean, I genuinely struggle to wrap my head around all this. what does it mean to be stateless in a country that you consider your own, in a country that you consider your homeland?
I mean, first, let us just try and understand what it means to be stateless at all. Just the notion of somebody without a place. It is the, your identity, any identity has become so linked in the world as we know it to a passport, to an identification card, to the notion of when someone asks you who you are, you say, I am from Myanmar. And any Rohingya you speak to will say that, I am from Myanmar. I'm a Rohingya from Myanmar. It's the most basic right of being able to say what their identity is. And to be denied that identity is one of the cruelest cuts of all. But there is more. I mean, in terms of the rights that they have, one of the things that we are working on right now, Francesca, is we look at satellite images of the villages that have been emptied in Rakhine State, from where these people were sent away in 2017. And you can actually see construction. And sometimes we're able to map, we're able to sit with the Rohingya refugee and figure out that is to be their land, where they once grew paddy, for instance. Or they would say, that was the tree from where we made the right turn to go to the mosque. And it's all gone. And there is no a question of reparation, because there is no question of ever the state even accepting that this land belonged to these people. So the levels of abuse that have occurred here are so enormous that it's really hard to explain to people who take these things for granted just how tenuous existence is for the Rohingya people.
So what, in this sense, because it's so difficult to understand, I want to kind of go slowly. So you're stateless in your own country. So it means that your own country doesn't want you, and you do not have a passport because you're not a citizen, so you can't even leave. So, a bit. Then what? What did you do?
Well, actually, what you do is what the Rohingya do quite often, which is that they tend to get on these boats. They try to arrive at shores where they might feel welcome. And you will see this over and over again, where they will be recognized and given some form of identification. So they will travel to South Asia, to Thailand, to Malaysia, a number of them, and hope that over there they will get eventually some form of statehood. So it's why I described earlier the notion of these boats on Bay of Bengal. And if I can only explain visually, Bay of Bengal is a very rough, it has very high waves. And they're on these really tiny boats that then go, and they then get transferred. They're often at the mercy of extremely corrupt and abusive trafficking agents. They often run out of food, or their engines break, or then they start drifting. And as they drift, if they're rescued by Coast Guard, or if they arrive at the shore of a country, they are pushed back. We have videos of them arriving where Coast Guard is standing there saying, Rohingya, go back, go back. Where are they supposed to go? But this is the big challenge. They are people that are forever looking for home, for shelter.
It's genuinely hard to fully grasp the extent of such a tragedy, really. So you mentioned the national verification card. So if you're stuck and you can't even get on a boat trying to get somewhere in search of a better future, what does this national verification card allow you?
So the national verification card is in the way that, so it doesn't allow you powers to vote. You cannot contest elections or select your own leaders. You cannot be part of the process by which any of that is permitted. What it does do is that you can travel, but when you travel from say one part of Myanmar to another, this can be used against you, because you don't have any other identity but the NVC, which marks you as as clearly. They don't even call them Rohingya; they have a particular term. It makes you an outsider in your own land. It really does. That's the problem. Now, yes, many Rohingya have had opportunities to travel to the capital when they've got, and some of them have even had political roles. I mean, in one of the things that happened in the elections that finally brought Aung San Suu Kyi to power was that there were a group of Rohingya who were very actively part of NLD and supporting her campaign. There was also a Rohingya political party that was running. So there were people who did managed to get the paperwork, but for the bulk of them in Rakhine State, that was not available to them. And therefore, what happens is that when there is any kind of violence, we have found that people are being corralled into detention centers. So a large number of Rohingya right now are in detention centers in really severe conditions. We use the word apartheid to describe how the Rohingya are treated in Myanmar. So it's of course, there are now perhaps more Rohingya outside of Myanmar than those inside, those that are inside, a number of them, up to about 100,000 of them, are in detention camps, in detention camp-like conditions. So it's a difficult situation.
You earlier mentioned traveling or attempting to reach better places in the subcontinent. The situation doesn't seem to be much better. It's only yesterday that the Supreme Court of India refused to grant relief in a petition challenging the detention of 150 Rohingya refugees in Jammu, and basically allowed their deportation back to Myanmar. What is interesting is that they observed that the right not to be deported is ancillary to the right to reside or settle in any territory of India. And they also noted that India is not a signatory of the 1951 Refugee Convention. You've written extensively about how the attempts to deport Rohingya refugees violate the principle of non-refoulement. That is the international norm that forbids returning people to a place where they can be at real risk of serious abuse. Can you help us make sense of all this in light of the current coup in Myanmar? So there is, a historical enmity, but there is also a very severe upheaval in the country that doesn't make it safe for anyone, let alone a prosecuted minority.
Sure, that's a big question, so I'll try and break it into pieces. Let's speak about the 40,000 odd Rohingya refugees in India. This is a number that is an official number. The government has said that there are about approximately 40,000. They have come to a large part following in waves. One lot came after 2015 violence, another wave after 2016 violence, and then of course the 2017 violence. So there've been various groups of people coming through. Now, what the controversy began with the Rohingya that showed up in Jammu and Kashmir in a contested state, which has witnessed a lot of violence. A group of Rohingya arrived and settled in Jammu. Jammu Kashmir is a province that is Muslim majority. It's the only Muslim majority province in India, but it's the settling of Muslim Rohingya in there was then seen by many political groups as perhaps attempting to alter the demography even further and bring more Muslims into this province. That was one of the things that was seen. That was initially contested. Jammu also has had, in the conflict in Jammu and Kashmir, a large number of Hindus were displaced from the Kashmir Valley, and they also settled in Jammu and remain there. They have still not, the state failed to ensure their safe return either to their original homes. So therefore, what happened was that there was a bit of a crisis, a bit of clash between these two groups that settled, and a political storm was brought from there, which began to get blown into something which is really alarming, because not only was India shifting away from its traditional position of supporting refugees. India has may not have signed the Refugees Convention, but it has a long history of supporting refugees. Whether it's the Tibetans or the Afghans or Sri Lankan Tamils. I mean, even people from Myanmar. I mean, there are large numbers of them have lived in India for a long time. So why the change? And it's because it coincides in some ways with the political movement in India right now, which is very strongly and stridently Hindu nationalist. And the most terrifying thing about this is very quickly some political leaders began to attribute to this very persecuted community ideas that they were a security risk. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Rohingya have in any way been involved in any kind of a situation that might be worrying to law enforcers. Yet that was the narrative that was brought forward. And again, to keep the political, their own political narrative going, one that unfortunately quite often stigmatizes Muslims. This process has been going on and on in terms of trying to get them, send them away, to deport them. Now, the Supreme Court judgment says they cannot be deported unless proper procedure has been followed. What really is proper procedure? What does it mean? Because the first thing that has to be accepted as customary law is the right of a refugee to a safe, voluntary, dignified return. Are those conditions being met? Are they going to be secure on the other side? So as much as we say that it's unsafe once they are sent back, is also the refugee's own right. And whether the Refugees Convention has been signed or not, that's customary international law that India has to abide by, particularly right now when India is a member of the Security Council, a member of the Human Rights Council. It wants a global role. It can hardly be sitting there trying to absolve itself of its international responsibilities by saying, but we haven't signed the Refugees Convention. So now that's the first thing. The second thing is what you alluded to, which is the condition of in Myanmar right now. Now, already, while the Rohingya were already a persecuted community, right now, since February, we have seen blood on the streets. We have seen a military junta that has forcibly taken charge, has overturned a democratically elected government, and is using excessive and indiscriminate force against peaceful protesters. Now, and we have already seen a large number of Burmese crossing into India again. These are not Rohingya. These are other Burmese, mostly coming into the northeastern side. But they are running as well, including police officers who said they didn't want to follow unlawful orders. So therefore, this is not the best. This is certainly not the situation where the right of a refugee to a safe, dignified, and voluntary return is going to be upheld when people are once again fleeing the kind of abuses that Myanmar is witnessing right now. Does that help? Sorry, that's a long answer.
No, it's perfect. We have, there is something that you just said that I want to follow up on. So you're talking about India being hospitable to refugees, and even in the present, as long as you are the right kind of refugee. And so, yeah. Can you comment on this?
That is true. You were asking me earlier about how that citizenship law was passed in Myanmar, and I said I don't know how the international community allowed it, because states pass laws. That's their privilege. They have a legislature to pass laws, but if it doesn't match international standards, and then how do they continue to exist? And that truly is the problem with the Citizenship Amendment Act that India passed, because in itself, what it does is it's blatantly discriminatory. It basically excludes Muslims from being allowed from allow Muslim asylum seekers to be treated in the same way as others if they are from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, or from Afghanistan. So basically, they either the Indian authorities will argue that these are Muslim majority states where religious minorities are persecuted, and therefore there is a reason to try and protect them. But and Muslims are not. But then that also shows a lack of understanding even for that reason, because there are plenty of Muslims who face discrimination. I mean, there are Hazaras in Afghanistan, there are the Shia in Pakistan, there are the Ahmadiyya community. So even within Muslims there are sects. So how could it was not a very one, it was a discriminatory law in itself, but two, it was not even very well informed in the drafting of and enactment of. So yes, it's a problem that this law exists, and we hope that the government will repeal it.
We have an audience question that we'll take right now because it sort of follows on what we are discussing. And it's Chandra from Delhi who asks, do you see similarities between the strategies put in place to strip Rohingyas of citizenship and the NRC CAA put in place in India?
So the CAA itself did not impact Muslims in India. It was basically a law that was focused towards fast tracking asylum claims of communities, religious minority communities, so Hindus, Muslims, Jains, Parsis, and so on, Buddhists who had come from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. So it was but what it does, and that is why the problem exists, is that when combined with the plans for creating a national population register and then filtering out of it and verifying those that are nationals of India, would create a number of problems, because to verify citizenship, as we've seen in Assam, requires legacy documents that most Indians don't have. I mean, we've seen, particularly women don't have it. You know, they marry, they travel, they go. You know, people. You know, it's a world where these documents often don't exist, and often because they are. I mean, you know, in NRC, the NRC process in Assam, for instance, was mired with these things of, you know, the spellings of names being different in one ID document as opposed to others, and so on and so forth. Now, in that situation, what is feared is that the CAA, as it exists, would even so enable anyone that is non-Muslim to automatically be recognized as a citizen. While if a Muslim who does not have the adequate paperwork or cannot, will have added layers. That was the concern, and that is what led to months and months of peaceful protests in India to oppose these policies.
I take the chance to ask all our audience members to send us questions, and we'll take them as we go ahead. I want to go back to what we were discussing earlier and the decision that has been taken by the Supreme Court. Because I wonder if this is a way to look at the roots of the decision. The BJP has been adamant in dealing with the Rohingyas as illegal immigrants and not as refugees. And obviously, this shifts the focus from what is, in fact, an international humanitarian crisis to a law and order issue, and therefore something that is dealt as an internal matter rather than something that the international community can interfere with. Is that the case? How does that work, do you think?
Well, there is an issue of irregular migration, not just to India, which is happening all over the world. I mean, we also have Indians who similarly turn up in Europe or the US. Irregular migration is a fact of modern life, and it is something that most states across the world are are trying to obstruct and stop and feel very anxious about. Now, that said, India also has a spate of irregular migration. It is true that a number of them come from Bangladesh and it is the natural flow of things. As much as we say to more privileged communities who also oppose this kind of migration, we will say that to the Indians as well, that when there is work, when there is a chance of employment, people tend to travel. So there is that set of people who are looking for economic gains. And that can be true of anybody who travels. So whether it's the Bangladeshi that comes to India or the Indian that goes to the US, this is a irregular migration that occurs quite often. Then there are the refugees. Now, the reason we treat the Rohingya differently in terms of considering them to be refugees is because of the huge number of abuses that have been documented by independent commissions over and over again. The UN fact-finding mission has found that what played out could even be some acts of genocide. There was ethnic cleansing. There crimes against humanity. These are in terms of when we met the Rohingya that arrived in 2016 and 2017, even in our line of work where we hear of numerous abuses, the kind of abuses that were described were quite unspeakable. The fact that there was just this kind of sexual violence that played out, the rampant murders that took place, even targeting little children, the testimonies were horrifying. Now that a state has to treat differently. So, a state can have policies towards irregular migrants, and certainly there are many governments that tend to resist that kind of flow of people. But that's a different bracket of people from the Rohingya refugees, who are refugees escaping severe persecution and discrimination.
I don't know. I mean, one would hope that in the face of such extermination, humanity would prevail over politics, but it doesn't seem to be the case.
Unfortunately, what we are witnessing in this region is quite upsetting. We are finding, and this is not just true in India and in Myanmar, but we are finding this in Sri Lanka as well. There is a tendency to discriminate against Muslims. Now, what happens is when Islam becomes the basis or Islamophobia comes into political discourse, when political leaders use that in their political campaigns to win votes, they create rifts that go much beyond the election. They might win the election by creating these kind of conversations around the security risk or the risk to life or the differences between communities or even collectively punishing entire communities for the acts of some. But in the end, what it does is it damages societies. And that's what we are fearing is happening now, even in India, because a Hindu nationalist campaign that then plays upon or builds into prejudice against minority groups, whether they're Christian or Muslim or even more recently even Sikhs, it tends to then create massive divisions, and those divisions are fostered with arguments of security threats, because how else can you be discriminatory? So therefore, that's what they've done with the refugees. They instead of understanding and empathizing with the fact that this is a community that is severely suffering, there is that layer that has been put in, which is based in religion.
We'll go back to this in a minute, but there is also a question from another member of the audience that somehow follows up on what you've just been discussing. And this person asks, can you discuss the national security argument that is used against the Rohingya or other refugee communities when making an argument to deny them asylum or refugee status?
So again, I think what we need to figure here is what is state policy and what is a political discourse or or the narrative that is followed by supporters perhaps of the government. So for instance, even on social media, if you hear the conversations, you will find that when I say, oh, well, these are refugees that have suffered tremendously, there is a slightly immature response. We don't have enough to give them. They are a security risk. Keep them in your own house. That kind of immature response, which often comes from not quite understanding what the leaders mean when they say certain things, and following somewhat blindly the argument that these are people that are somehow going to, as I think the Home Minister once described, they must have, migrants as termites, illegal migrants as termites who are going to eat up the economy. And I know that thinking. Now that thinking is that's part of political conversation. Those are part of campaigns. Those are not policies. Those are things that leaders say and their followers embrace and amplify to a point where it becomes a security risk. So we need to distinguish between that and state policies. Now, in state policy, what is happening is that the Indian government is arguing that it is not signed the Refugees Convention, and therefore it is not responsible for the Rohingya refugees. And the counter to that argument is very, very clear. These are people that have already been persecuted tremendously, and they fled. There is clear evidence from independent UN documents that they have fled persecution. And there's an added layer that in the current environment in Myanmar, where there is such a security threat, there is no way that these people are going to be safe if they are returned, and it is the responsibility of the state to ensure their safety. So now those two are different issues. One is what a government does, and one is what political leaders do when they're trying to get into government. Once you get into government, you're the government, so you have to behave like the government.
Thank you. It's disheartening thinking of the status of the current government, but maybe we do not go into that direction right now, and we leave it there. So I want to go back to a recent episode. And so you just mentioned that there are about 40,000 Rohingyas in India right now. And they live in different states and in different cities and different provinces. And they're mostly, the bulk of them lives in camps and slums in dreadful conditions. And also, as we discussed, many of them are undocumented. So the starting point is already very complicated. Now, I want to discuss with you to try and understand the recent failed attempt at deporting to Myanmar a 15-year-old girl who had initially arrived to India, not from Myanmar, but from Bangladesh. So what we have around the story of this young girl is a very, very intricate geopolitical situation. Can you help us disentangle it? Because it's just very complicated to piece everything together.
It's actually one of the saddest stories that we've come about from recent times. Once this, we've received some text messages from forwarded by a Rohingya activist from the father of this, who says he's the father of this girl, and he claims that she was trafficked, became a victim of sexual trafficking from the camp, and that is how she disappeared, and was later found in India. We don't know the facts for sure. What we do know is a state, the Indian state, has a responsibility not just to protect the rights of refugees, but even more so has the responsibility to protect the rights of a child. This is a child. To try and send her back to Myanmar, where she has no family, where the government has made no attempts to even figure out who she's going to be handed off to the care of, it was completely impossible to understand that such an exercise should even have been undertaken. And the Myanmar border guards refused to take her back, and now she's been brought back into the care of NGOs, which also raises all kinds of questions. How was she being sent? If the entire logic of deportation is that the receiving state has to receive them, acknowledge them to be citizens, and take them back. So was that process even followed? How? What were the documents that was used? I mean, the irresponsibility in this entire story is really, really hard to understand. And we hope that the government will, because the verification process is still needed. You know, what the child says, who are caregivers her, what will be her condition if it is proved that the people who are claiming to be her family are indeed her family, will they take care of her? What is the kind of protection that she's going to be provided? What kind of counseling will she have? What kind of support will she have? These are things that responsible states do, not try and bump someone across the border.
On this, there is a very practical question that I personally don't understand. So we just discussed the fact that Myanmar declared them stateless. So then, I mean, how could the Indian government or the state or whomever is the responsible agency to do that, deport a person to a state that doesn't acknowledge the deportee as their own citizen? I mean, how can that process be even started?
It's actually an interesting question, because we are asking this also about when Myanmar says that it's going to verify people on what grounds, what are the basis of it, and what will be their rights when these people are returned. Are they going to be put into detention camps? Now, in the past, India has deported 12 people who India said had volunteered to return, and the Myanmar authorities took back. Now, it's the responsibility of the sending country to also see what kind of protections they enjoy on the other side. Were they put into jail? Were they beaten? Were they tortured? That is the responsibility of the sending country. And those are things that, unfortunately, I don't think India is even considering when it wants to send people back like this, because the responsibility will be India's, whatever it might say about not having signed a refugees convention. I keep saying that under international law, these are all protections that exist for people, and India has to comply with those standards.
One very basic question comes to mind. How is it possible that is a story that is so tragic and so loaded at so many levels barely made it to the headlines of any international newspaper?
It isn't that it didn't make the headlines, Francesca. It did, but then it dropped from the headlines. In 2017, when this was when the spate of refugees came in to Bangladesh, and literally I cannot describe to you how they were coming. They were pouring in tens of thousands, carrying literally all that they could have on their heads, and they were fleeing. At that point, yes, there was coverage, there was attention. Then
Meenakshi, your voice is breaking. Let's wait for a second. Would you mind restarting, because we lost you?
Yes, I know. I'm sorry. It just went round and round.
No problem. But start from the beginning, because we lost most of what you said.
Right. Yeah. I was saying that, you said, why does the world not know about this? And I said, actually, the world did. There was a time when in 2017, in August of 2017, when people were arriving in droves, when the Rohingya were arriving in droves, like tens of thousands every day, crowded into this on the streets, literally on the streets in Bangladesh, in near Cox's Bazar. And Bangladeshis were incredibly good to them at that point, is to bring truckloads of food and clothes to support the refugee community at that point of time. Now, at that point, yes, the world did notice. But then a new crisis came along and another one. Then we had the pandemic, and people seem to have forgotten that these are people that are still waiting, and they are still waiting to safely go home. You ask any Rohingya in the refugee camp, and the only thing they will say is, I want to go back home. I want to go back to Myanmar. Make it happen. And don't forget us.
The right of return is something that would deserve an entire conversation in itself. And I really hope that, the Palestinians here do not set a precedent, because it's more than 70 years that they are waiting to return. So I'm hoping that this is now going to be the example to follow. I want to go back to the discussion we had about the citizens, the CAA. So you've written that all the citizenship amendment have do risk to put the Rohingyas in even greater danger. And so, obviously the CAA and the NRC are the result of a growing nationalist and Hindu nationalist, in this particular case, government. But this extreme form of nationalism is not unique to India. It's a situation that is more and more apparent across the subcontinent. How do you think the geopolitics of a growing nationalism in South Asia is going to affect the future of the Rohingya refugees?
The CAA NRC is actually a little bit more complicated than just about the Rohingya. The NRC process is from Assam. It goes back to partition. It goes back to 1947, and the fact that a lot of there was a migration of Hindus and Muslims across borders when Bangladesh was still East Pakistan, and then again a spate of refugees that came in 1971 when Bangladesh won its war of independence. So in that way there are the Rohingya is a later issue. The NRC process was part of an Assamese nationalist movement, a nationalism movement, and where Assamese people felt that they were being overrun by Bengali-speaking settlers who were taking away their resources. Now, the challenge that was happening in Assam is literally what we see, and it's not just in the subcontinent. We are witnessing this kind of nationalism, this kind of aversion of immigrants across the world. We find this challenge everywhere. And this challenge is coming up to a large part because we are also seeing it coincide with the rise of demagogues, rise of these leaders who try and promote these kind of politics that prey upon the insecurity of majority communities, suggest to them that they're no longer safe, that these people are going to create more disturbances and will go into their resources. So it's, as I said, this is something that we are dealing with in Europe as well. It's something that we saw the US president talk in the most irresponsible manner about. And in subcontinent, unfortunately, what we are also seeing is that kind of discriminatory policy being worded into law, into official practice, and that's where the problem comes up. So, for instance, I'll tell you, if you talk about Sri Lanka, world over has been reeling under this pandemic. Sri Lanka decided that every person that died because of COVID had to be cremated, which meant that Muslims were denied their burial rights. And there was no logic to it. The World Health Organization has never, people were burying their dead in other parts of the world, but in Sri Lanka, they had to be cremated. And it was completely not something that the WHO guidelines had prescribed or anything of that sort, but it was just unkind, discriminatory policies that hurt the sentiments of minority Muslims in Sri Lanka. In India, once COVID broke out, this was not to do with the Rohingya. This is to do with stigmatizing a Muslim population. And initially, that was what was done. They were repeatedly, again, not by the state necessarily, but by BJP leaders, which is the ruling party, by their supporters, There was, and including on networks that support, that are pro-government, this kind of stigmatizing, which feeds the public information. You know, in a pandemic situation where where you have very little information anyway, it just, and everyone is frightened. This just added a layer of fright and discrimination at a time when everyone needed to work together. So that we are seeing this in various forms in various parts of the world, and it has to stop, because if it doesn't stop, then the divisions within society will eventually be very hard to breach. And so, today is the Rohingya, I mean, we're seeing this in Myanmar. And actually, I just want to go back to Myanmar, because right now we are, the world is uniting to a large part in trying to, calling the junta to restore the democratically elected government. But Aung San Suu Kyi, when she was in office, when she was leading the government in Myanmar, did not speak in favor of the Rohingya. She did not back. I mean, for a woman that had won the Nobel Peace Prize, to see her next standing at the court in Hague, defending the military that had committed such terrible atrocities upon the Rohingya people, was really heartbreaking. And so now and at that point of time, of course, and many of her supporters in Myanmar would oppose the Rohingya. They would say, oh, well, they are not our people. They should not be here. They should go back to Bangladesh, and so on and so forth. Now, when these protests are going on, we've begun to hear glimmerings of this. We're hearing the Rohingya speak for the rights of the peaceful protesters and supporting them. We are hearing protesters also speaking to the rights of the Rohingya and their right to return. So, history manages to turn itself in many ways, but policy of discrimination is never the right one. It's just not something that should be ever permitted.
Do you think the global rise of Islamophobia, following up on what you just said, makes it more difficult for the plight of the Rohingya to be visible?
No, Francesca, I don't think that the international community is ignoring the Rohingya any more than it's ignoring any other sort of situation of serious human rights challenges. The trouble with the Rohingya is that there are no simple solutions. These are people that have to be, the international community has to make sure that they can go back home. Now that means working with the Myanmar authorities. Now, which authority? Right now we have the military, the same military in charge that once led the abuses against the Rohingya. So it's going to be it's going to be a long haul. In the interim, I think what is needed for the international community is to support Bangladesh a lot more in keeping the Rohingyas safe. Unfortunately, the Bangladeshis are also running out of welcome. And so we found that, for instance, Bangladesh, now there are, for almost 8 months, there was no internet. Internet was cut off. They built all these fences to try and restrict their right to movement, which meant that recently when there was a fire, people couldn't even escape to safety because the gates had been enclosed. We have been documenting the fact that so many Rohingya have been relocated to this island called Bhashan Char, which is a little island in the Bay of Bengal. And, when the Bangladeshis were making this, they did so with the assistance of of China and with the assistance of UK engineers and so on. When they were building it, they were very proud of it. They thought it was a good solution, except that a lot of independent experts were worried because it's an island again in the middle of Bay of Bengal, which has severe climate conditions. There are often strong winds. There are storm surges. So the Bangladesh had said that it would bring in technical experts to make sure that the island is safe before moving people there. Instead, what we found is that almost 10,000 have already been moved, and now Bangladesh is asking UNHCR and others to come in and help look after them. So these are poor policies, and these are not things that should be done in the way that they are. Bangladesh will say that we are a poor country. We should not be landed with 1 million refugees forever and after. And what is the world doing to solve this? And it's true. What is the world trying to do to solve it? It is something that needs much more attention than it is receiving right now.
So I understand that this is a very long game, but I have a couple of more questions, and one is about what can the International Court of Justice do in all this?
Well, the International Court of Justice, the initial ruling was to already say to Myanmar that they should not create conditions where genocide occurs. Now, in that case, what is happening now is in violation not only in Rakhine State but everywhere. I mean, this is a government, this is a military that is mowing down protesters on the streets. I mean, what? How is this even going to be sustainable? And certainly the international community, including countries like India or Malaysia or Thailand and all these countries that are resisting the refugees coming in, but are unwilling to find their voice in condemning the actions of the military, need to do so, if not for any other reason, for the right reasons, which is that they should be rights-respecting states, is also because that is the only way that people will stop coming to fleeing. If there's persecution in some place, people will naturally have to try and find a way to protect their lives, and they will cross those borders. So, for instance, India cannot remain agnostic about we deal with whoever is in office, because whoever is in office is committing so many atrocities that people are fleeing. So even as it grapples with one set of refugees, it's going to get another. And therefore, it's very important, not just because these countries should be upholding rights, but also in their own interest, because if they do not want to have refugee populations crowd into their borders.
I have one last question because we've reached our mark. I understand that you said that international community is not ignoring the Rohingya, but I cannot help but feel that the international community is, to be kind, apathetic towards the tragedy of the Rohingya. What more can be done, or what at all can be done?
A lot more can and should be done. I just said that the international community was stirred out of complacency in August 2017 when we witnessed the kind of abuses that the Rohingya fled. At that point of time, there was a sort of jolt to the conscience. Since then, there is apathy. There needs to be much more. There need to be targeted sanctions. There need to be abjuring of any kind of business dealings with the military in Myanmar, which committed the abuses in the past and is continuing to commit those abuses. There needs to be a lot more pressure to make sure that the conditions are such that the Rohingya can, as we keep saying, the refugees have the right to safe, voluntary and dignified return, and that those conditions have to be enabled and met by the international community, with building a lot more pressure than it is right now. And while the international community was a little bit indulgent, perhaps, when Aung San Suu Kyi was still holding office in Myanmar, what it's done now is that it's ended up putting the military enabling the military to continue the abuses that it is committing right now. So therefore, for a return to democracy that the people of Myanmar are protesting for, there also need to be these terms set that all citizenship rights of everybody are protected. I mean, these are policies that the states need to adopt right now to make sure that people of Myanmar, all people of Myanmar, and not just including the sort of ethnic conflicts that are existing in other parts of Myanmar that the UN fact-finding mission has cited. All of those have to be addressed, and have to be addressed for peaceful future. I'm sorry, I was looking at because I think we're running out of time.
I mean, we're fine. It's just there's so much to think about. But if you have a few more seconds, there is one last thing that I want to ask.
Sure, but I think we're out of time.
No. I mean, if people stay with us another few minutes, I think we're okay. What I just want to ask is, what about concerned citizens? The big international institutions have their own pace, but what can civil society do in a situation like this?
It's the most important thing, and I think that one of the things that the public, everybody is a member of civil society. Everyone has a role in this, and members of the public need to stop sometimes being persuaded by narratives that they're going to be persecuted, and to recall the responsibilities that they themselves have to uphold. I often try and say that everybody is a minority in some context. Everyone can be persecuted in some context, and therefore to fall into a majoritarian club somewhere is defeating the purpose of what should be universal human rights protections.
Well, then I think that's the best way to close our conversation, to remind everyone not to join any majoritarian club and remain mindful of the people around them. Meenakshi, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.